If you were a discerning buyer looking to purchase a mid-engine sports car for yourself back in the late 60s and early 70s, you were left without much choice. You had the Lotus Europa for the smaller, balanced sports car, and then moving up in price, you had the Ferrari 246 Dino and even the Lamborghini Miura sitting atop that list. Now, these were all great cars in their own right. There was just one problem, particularly for potential buyers stateside, and that was the availability of parts and qualified technicians to work on these cars. Should anything break on one of these, and you would be looking at a lot of downtime to repair them, with parts having to be sourced from England or even Italy. But one car sought to change all of that and blow the mid-engine sports car market wide open, with a car that was relatively affordable for what it was, and one that packed a bulletproof American drivetrain that could make gobs of power with a variety of off-the-shelf parts. This car was to be America's new supercar, and this is the story of the legendary De Tomaso Pantera. The name Pantera is Italian for the word panther, which was a fitting name for a car that was as low-slung and menacing as the Pantera would become. And the man behind the madness of the Pantera was Alejandro De Tomaso, an ex-Formula One racer turned automobile manufacturer. Alejandro began his Formula One career in 1957 for a private team based out of Italy. And throughout that season, he proved to be a very decent driver, but certainly not a world champion caliber driver. And by 1959, De Tomaso had quickly shifted his efforts to his new car company, De Tomaso, which would be his outlet to build race cars, prototype cars, and even road cars as time went on. The first of these road cars, which was the eloquently styled and nimble Vallelunga, of which just 59 were produced. This first car gave De Tomaso the confidence to build their second road car, the Mangusta, which was where the Pantera drew a lot of its roots from. The Mangusta was a Ford small block V8 powered mid-engine sports car that, funny enough, spawned out of a business deal that went south with Carroll Shelby. And we have made a full video on this car already, so that will be linked at the end to go watch. But the Mangusta was a slightly more successful car than the Vallelunga, selling just about 400 cars in total. But the car itself wasn't world-beating by any means. But the Mangusta needed to walk so that the Pantera could run. This car served really as a proof of concept that De Tomaso could design and produce capable sports cars beyond just a tiny production quantity. And because of Ford's involvement with the prior Mangusta, from a drivetrain perspective going well, they were willing to expand their business partnership with De Tomaso, and the Pantera was going to be the car to do it with, as in America, they would be sold through Lincoln and Mercury dealers. The Pantera body would be designed by Tom Giarda at the design house Ghia, and upon the first sketch, they knew they had something special. The Pantera was the perfect blend of an aggressive wedge shape mixed with all the well-sculpted and proportioned Italian design elements that helped give it insane road presence when put together. From the flip-up front headlights to even the repurposed Alfa Romeo Berlinetta taillights, it made this car one of the best-looking cars of the era. And this body was part of a new steel monocoque chassis for the Pantera that was supported by a four-wheel independent suspension setup that used coilover shocks and unequal length A-arms all the way around. In the true spirit of De Tomaso racing pedigree, the Pantera's suspension setup was designed with the performance-oriented driver in mind, with factory disc brakes at all four corners and an engaging manual rack and pinion steering setup. And continuing with their Ford partnership as they had for the Mangusta, the Pantera would also utilize a mid-mounted 4V8. This time around, though, it was not the 302 Windsor motor. This time, it was a 351 cubic inch Cleveland 4V8, which was a very noticeable improvement at around 330 horsepower in stock trim, giving the Pantera considerably more torque down low than the 302 or even the 289s did in the prior Mangusta. All this performance was coming from a car that would weigh in just around 3,150 pounds dry, which meant that the Pantera was going to be a serious contender basically anywhere in the world. 0 to 60 happened in 5.5 seconds, and the Pantera also had a 5-speed transaxle, which meant that it could top out stock at around 160 miles per hour and rock the quarter mile in the high 13s to low 14-second range. And by 1970, the world got their first glimpse of the Pantera at the New York Auto Show, and unsurprisingly, it was a smash hit. At a target launch MSRP of just under $10,000 US, this made the Pantera literally half the price of the comparable Lamborghini Miura, which also, funny enough, both happened to have the same wheelbase. The Pantera was a very attractive proposition, both visually and from a value standpoint, and by 1971, the first Panteras had successfully made their voyage across the ocean and landed in the Lincoln and Mercury dealerships in America. And they actually sold pretty well here, with 1,000 cars sold within the first year, plus an extra 300 selling abroad as well. But not all was great. In seemingly classic Italian automaker fashion at the time, the build quality on some of these Panteras was, well, 95% of the way there for the early cars. These hand-built cars weren't all perfect, and for $10,000 US, US customers would expect them to be, and Ford wouldn't want to sell something through their dealership network that they couldn't guarantee the quality on, as they would be partially on the hook. As a result, Ford then acquired an 84% controlling stake in the De Tomaso company that year, and helped overhaul production to get the cars more in spec, with things like their panel gaps and overall just have better attention to detail. And this would kick off the 20-plus year production run of the Pantera that would spawn countless variants of the iconic car and a plethora of mid-year refreshes aimed at keeping the platform alive. So buckle up your lap belts, as there's a lot to go through here. For 1972, the De Tomaso Pantera got slight modifications from the 1971 launch version, which included the introduction of a new larger camshaft, actually from the Ford 428 Cobra jet. The 1972 model year also had a lower compression ratio to help with emissions regulations, and it also got a more breathable set of exhaust manifolds. These cars, though, still maintained the small bumpers. Then, during the later half of 1972 through 1974, we saw the introduction of the new Pantera L, where the L stood for Lusso. The Lussos were now fitted with the US crash test compliant bumpers, which did sour the beautiful lines of the Pantera. But to be honest, this car did fare much better than others from the period, as these new bumpers, although they weren't great, they weren't hideous either. Power dropped to just 265 horsepower for the US market cars though, and the interior did get a refreshed dashboard design that actually did look a lot better, especially when looking at that amazing gated shifter in the Pantera. The Pantera Lussos, though, did get lots of quality of life updates and refinements, which greatly improved the overall experience outside of just speed alone, which was enough to get the Pantera Lusso to win Road and Track's Import Car of the Year contest. And in Europe, at the same time, De Tomaso launched the Pantera GTS, which was a higher performance variant of the Pantera sans the emissions restrictions based around Group 3 racing. These cars received a high compression ratio 351 and some further breathing mods that let it make 345 horsepower. The GTS was also brought to the United States in extremely limited quantities without all the cool go fast parts though, so it was really just an exterior trim package. And all of this went on until 1975, when, fatefully, Ford officially pulled the plug on the Pantera stateside after selling a total of 5,500 cars through their dealer network. And the Pantera actually, for a sports car a relative niche, sold pretty well, but by this time, the 351 Cleveland was now no longer available in the US, and with sales slowing and a performance/gas crisis underway, Ford jumped ship on selling the Pantera stateside. But sales abroad would still go on, and they would end up creating some of the coolest Panteras ever as a result. Amidst the changing times, De Tomaso now had to source the 351 Ford Cleveland motors from Ford Australia as the engine was still being produced over there. And that's what they did. And they essentially continued to produce the Pantera and sell it abroad and even in the US with some gray market importers until 1980, pretty much unchanged. But 1980 was when the decade-old sports car got a second lease on life. This was when the De Tomaso Pantera GT5 came out, and they would follow the Lamborghini Countach playbook for a facelift by making the car way more outlandish visually. These new GT5 Panteras received a full body kit that included giant wheel arches, a new lower valance, and a huge rear wing. Gargantuan 345 rear tires were now fitted, and the power was now bumped to over 350 horsepower because of the lack of emissions regulations abroad. Then, after the GT5, there was the GT5S, which is essentially the same thing as the GT5, just with a more subdued body, but only slightly. See, the GT5s still featured a giant wing and wider fenders. Just now, they had more nicely molded body pieces versus the older tack-on looking style of the GT5. These cars were built throughout the 1980s, and just over a total of 400 GT5 and GT5S cars were built. Even with the chassis refresh that occurred in 1980, there was no hiding that the Pantera was beginning to show its age, and most people thought that this was going to be the end of the line for the car. But much to everyone's surprise, 1990 saw one final swan song for the De Tomaso Pantera, the Pantera 90 SI. And this car wasn't just another version of the GTS that was refreshed again. No, this new 90 SI Pantera was totally redesigned by the one and only Marcello Gandini, the man who designed the Miura, the Countach, and the Diablo. The redesigned Pantera 90 SI was stunning. Giardini managed to somehow capture the essence of the original car and facelift it in a way very akin to the Porsche 911, where the same timeless shape remained, but it somehow looked so new at the same time. This new Pantera pulled design inspiration from the Ferrari F40 and various other sports cars of the time, and underneath, the original Pantera chassis was also replaced with a brand new tube frame chassis that housed a newly revised suspension setup with even better brakes. From a chassis and design standpoint, the Pantera 90 SI was brought into a totally new era. But there was one problem. The 351 Cleveland engine itself was no longer in production anywhere in the world. So De Tomaso would have to go ahead and pull what was essentially a Fox body Mustang 302 with an EFI setup and put that into the new Pantera. This kept the Ford soul of the car alive, but at a cost of nearly 100 horsepower less than the prior 351, as these new 302s could only make around 255 horsepower without opening them up and changing the heads and cam. De Tomaso sold the Pantera 90 SI from 1990 to 1993, with a total of 41 cars being produced for those years, until it was phased out for the new De Tomaso Guara, which was to be the successor to the Pantera that never quite took off. And then tragically by 93, the Pantera's 20-plus year production run was over, and all that was left was a group of car enthusiasts around the world that were still enamored by the gorgeous Italian-American hybrid. Today, the Pantera is revered as one of the ultimate classics, and even a fantastic resto mod candidate for somebody looking to hot rod together their own Italian-bodied beast at a fraction of the cost of what it would cost to do so to a comparable Ferrari. And personally, based on the history, the look, the feel, and that glorious American V8, I would take a Pantera over a Ferrari any day. But let me know if you feel the same way in the comments down below. And thank you all for watching another episode of our Rare Cars documentary series. If you enjoyed this video, we would greatly appreciate it if you could drop a like and also share this video with other enthusiasts. Also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the Rare Cars YouTube channel and smash that notification bell for more documentary style videos just like this on the world's most interesting cars. Until next time, enthusiasts.